Roman names give us quite a few nice little insights into how the Romans thought of the world and the state, because they're tied up with public life and your duty or obligation, your status within the Republic. Now, in the early imperial period, the system is much the same. Over time, it will develop and become rather more complicated and develop in different ways. So we're really talking about the Republic and the early empire. Now, the classic form for a man's name would be the tria nomina, the three names. So Gaius Julius Caesar, Marcus Livius Drusus, something like that. Broken up into the three parts, the first is what they call the praenomen, the first name, the prename, like Gaius, Titus, Lucius, things like that, Marcus, another famous one. So that's what people would call you around the dinner table, your nearest and dearest, and help to distinguish you from other people. The central part of the name is, in some respects, the most significant. It's the oldest, the nomen. That's the group of wider clan, families, joined together to which you belong, tribe almost, though not quite. None of those words exactly match how the Romans understood things. In Julius Caesar's case, it's the Julii. Now, from that, you can tell that he's a patrician. The Julii are one of these ancient aristocratic families that went back to the early days of the Republic, and in most cases before that. In the case of Julius Caesar's family, they even claim descent from the goddess Venus and a connection with Romulus, and before that with Aeneas and the refugees from Troy. How far all of that mythology was developed in Julius Caesar's day when he was born, and how much becomes far more clearly defined under Augustus, is a lot harder to say. But at a more basic level, when we're coming on to names, it means that if you know someone is a Julius, you know he's a patrician, you know he belongs to this big group, this clan, for want of a better term. Other people will be marked out as from the plebeian families. These are the overwhelming majority of Roman citizens, and by 100 BC, when Julius Caesar is born, many plebeian families are as well established, as aristocratic, as wealthy, as influential, as born to the consulship virtually as any of the patricians, in some case more so. Then you come on to the cognomen, the third element of the name, and in the case of Julius Caesar, that's Caesar. Now that's the branch of family within the clan. So there might be lots of people called Julius, but there are only certain ones that are called Caesar. Now, again, by 100 BC, by Julius Caesar's day, there is more than one line of Julii Caesares. And one group that are not that closely related to Caesar, their cousins at 2 or 3 times remove, are starting to do quite well in public life. But it's interesting, these are in a different voting tribe. That's another branch of distinction that we'll come on to a little bit later. But it meant that a Roman could hear the name Gaius Julius Caesar and they'd have a fair idea of his broader grouping, his broader ancestry, and more specifically, okay, he's one of the Caesares, so he's one of a couple of branches of families that we know about, and he's called Gaius, so we can try and pin him down. The Romans would usually add, when they were putting the name formally, son of the praenomen of your father, so son of Gaius, son of Marcus, whatever it might be. So between that and working out roughly who's who amongst the, at this stage still 300 or so senators who belong to that highest council of the Roman state, you could work out fairly quickly who someone was, who they were likely to be related to, their connections, and gauge some sense of their importance. Now, there were some clan groups, some people who'd not been quite as prolific, didn't have as many different branches of the family as others. So you do get some Romans with simply a praenomen and a nomen. Classic case would be Marcus Antonius, who will be Caesar's ally to a more or less close degree and go on to famously fight against Octavian, the young Caesar, Augustus. Now, the Antonii are important. They're a plebeian family who've done very well and have moved into the highest levels of Roman society, and they are well established. Antony will, according to Cicero, keep on boasting that he isn't just consul, he is an Antonius. This matters, this tells you how important I am, how I deserve to be at the top, I deserve to lead you, simply because my family produces such great men. So the Antonii don't need to distinguish themselves in this way. They are simply the two names. And there are several families like that. And there are others like Gaius Marius, who is a new man, someone to break into politics, who again hasn't achieved an extra name. And the Pompeys are another group like this. Now, Gnaeus Pompeius will also give us the addition that you sometimes have the nickname that's added. In his case, Magnus the Great, given to him supposedly by Sulla, perhaps wholly sincerely, perhaps with a touch of irony. This is when Pompey has done spectacularly well at a very young age by raising a private army and giving it to Sulla in the civil war and leading it on his behalf and doing very well killing other Romans. So to gain the name the Great for that is a somewhat ambiguous recommendation for anybody. So you have Verrucosus, which is spotty, Strabo, squinty. Some of these names have their origins in nicknames. Some of them will turn into family names from that. Ahenobarbus, from Redbeard, Gingerbeard, this sort of thing. So these things will become locked into the system, and it may well be that just with us, just like us these days, that just because somebody's called Smith doesn't mean they have anything to do with ironworking these days. Once it did, and other names become so familiar as a name you associate them with the person rather than the thing they actually come from. So a Roman could be distinguished by his three names: Gaius Julius Caesar, or whatever it might be, son of Gaius, and then the voting tribe to which he belonged. So that would allow most Romans, simply with those details, to pin down pretty quickly who this person was. And that was especially true of the aristocracy and those involved more actively in voting and vote arranging within the popular assemblies, people who took an interest in public life. And so much of this has to do with the Roman aristocracy's desire to win elections, to win high office, to add further distinction to the family name. So hence the promotion of the family at every opportunity, including the funeral of any member. Hence the celebration of the past achievements, because that offered a promise for the next generation. Well, our ancestors did all these wonderful things for you, you can vote for us and we'll do great things for the Republic. So the names help people to understand just who was who within the Roman system, and it helped them politically. You have to be a little bit careful. In some of the more modern traditions of history and the development of prosopography in the 20th century, there was a tendency to think, okay, we can work out from the names who these people are, to whom they're related, and assume that this means they will be politically sympathetic, perhaps even allies. Doesn't really work that way. It's far more complicated than that. There are 300 or so senators in 100 BC when Caesar's born. After Sulla the dictator has reformed things, there are around about 600, and that number will grow during the course of the 1st century BC. So you've got a lot of people in competition for a limited number of public offices which cannot be shared, which means that simply having the same name and a family connection doesn't necessarily mean that you're all going to be on the same side. Now, Julius Caesar, for instance, is for a while a hunted fugitive under Sulla's regime, whereas the other Julii Caesares, the other branch of the family that belonged to this different voting tribe, have been more or less open supporters of Sulla, certainly more sympathetic to him than his opponents, and have done quite well under the new regime. So you've got part of the family on one side, part on the other. And that's obviously true in many civil wars throughout history, but it's no more true than with the Romans, and it's also a reflection of the complexity of day-to-day politics. Now, having said all this about the men, we can come in by looking at how the Romans, particularly the Roman aristocracy, named their daughters, how a woman's name worked. And that's very different, and it's also very revealing. Because whereas most Romans, if not quite all, would have the full tria nomina, in the case of your daughter, when Julius Caesar had a daughter, she was naturally called Julia, the feminine form of the nomen, the clan name. And you'd be a Caecilia, a Livia, a Claudia, whatever it happened to be. And if that person had more than one daughter, then they all get the same name. They might be numbered or marked out in some other way for official purposes, but as far as the state is concerned, a woman cannot vote. A woman cannot stand for office. Therefore, you don't need to be quite so specific as to who she is, because obviously her nearest and dearest and those around her ought to know who she is anyway. So one assumes that if your name was Julius and you had 3 daughters and they were all called Julia, there'd be some system within the family whereby you could converse around the dining room table without confusing everybody as to how it all worked. And of course you have Brutus, for instance, the man who leads the assassination plot that kills Julius Caesar. He had 3 sisters, one of them Junia Tertia, Junior the Third. His family name, his nomen was Junius, therefore Junia, was married to Cassius, his co-conspirator. And of course there's the Ciceronian joke that because Caesar was alleged to have had an affair not simply with Servilia, Brutus's mother, but also with Junia Tertia, Cassius's wife, and during the course of some auctions, Servilia got things at a knockdown price, bought some property confiscated from people who'd lost out in the Civil War, and Cicero jokes, well, she gets a third off the price, alluding to the affair. But again, something else quite significant in that. Remember, Servilia is called Servilia, even though she's married more than once, to Brutus's father, who gets himself killed in 78 BC in earlier Civil War fighting, and then later on to others. Her name doesn't change. And when Julius Caesar's daughter Julia marries Pompey, she does not change her name. So a Roman woman remains part of her ancestral clan throughout her life, whether she's married or not. So again, you can see within this, yes, obviously you see the dominance of the men within society and within public life. This is an exclusively male preserve in an open sense, but also the daughters have independence. They are not simply property, and they do get, in fact, it's a case they keep their own property when they're married, and they take it with them when they're divorced. Hence the take your things and go formula for a divorce. So all just within a name, you can start to glimpse different aspects of how the Romans looked at the world, and it isn't exactly the same way as we look at the world. In fact, there are many significant differences, but you can still see a system, traces of that society, traces of the political system around it, simply within something as straightforward, as ordinary, as just what you call each other and how you refer to individuals within the state.